The rain had not yet begun when Wilhelmina Ashworth learned, once again, that she was the daughter nobody remembered to introduce. She stood at the edge of the drawing room at Faircross Hall, gloved hands folded before her plain grey gown, while her mother guided her younger sister Rosalind toward the fire like a jeweller unveiling a gem. "This is my daughter, Mrs." Ashworth said, and the word carried such warmth that it seemed impossible another daughter stood only 3 feet away, unnamed, unnoticed, dressed in a gown 2 seasons old, because there had been no money left for a new one after Rosalind's had been ordered from London. Nobody in the room looked at Mina. That, she had come to understand, was simply how it was. She was 24, which in the unforgiving arithmetic of her mother's world made her nearly a spinster, while Rosalind, not yet 20, was spoken of as though she were a comet passing once in a generation. Rosalind had their mother's gold hair and their late grandmother's sapphire eyes. Mina had her father's plain brown hair, his quiet grey eyes, and, some said unkindly behind gloved hands, his unfortunate seriousness. She had long since stopped waiting for someone to call her lovely. She had learnt instead to be useful, for usefulness, unlike beauty, could not be taken from her by a change in fashion or a trick of candlelight. It was for this reason that when the invitation came from Ravenscliffe, the great estate belonging to Julian Thorne, Duke of Everleigh, Mina was not surprised to hear her mother speak only of Rosalind's chances. "The Duke has come home to find a wife before the year is out," Mrs. Ashworth said over breakfast, her voice trembling with the particular greed of a woman who had spent a decade watching her family's fortunes decline. "His grandmother, the Dowager Duchess, has all but confirmed it. Every family within 30 miles has been invited to the house party, and Rosalind shall outshine every one of them. And Mina shall come as well, I suppose," said Mina's father, not unkindly, though he did not look up from his newspaper. "Mina may come to keep Rosalind company," her mother said, in the tone of a woman granting a favour. "It would hardly do to leave her behind, though I cannot imagine the Duke will spare her more than a passing glance." Mina said nothing. She had learned that arguing only prolonged the humiliation. She poured her tea and thought, not for the first time, that there was a peculiar peace in being invisible. No one expected anything of the invisible. No one broke their heart. She did not yet know that this would be the week everything about her quiet, overlooked life would change. That a man everyone called cold, and some called cruel, was about to notice her more closely than anyone ever had, precisely because she did not know she was being watched at all. The carriage ride to Ravenscliffe took the better part of a day, through country lanes gone gold and rust with early autumn, past hedgerows heavy with the last blackberries, until the towers of the great house rose grey and formidable against a lowering sky. Rosalind pressed her face nearly to the glass, breathless with excitement. Mina watched the house grow larger with a feeling closer to dread. She had heard the stories, as everyone had. The Duke of Everleigh was said to be a man of few words and fewer smiles, a man who had once been engaged to a woman of great beauty and greater ambition, a Miss Cordelia Vane, who had vanished 3 years past with a fortune in Thorne family jewels and the family's trust besides. Since then, it was whispered, the Duke trusted no woman's affections, and any lady who angled too openly for his favour found herself coldly, unmistakably dismissed. "He sounds perfectly dreadful," Rosalind said with a shiver of pleasure, for to a girl of 19, a wounded and unattainable duke was more romantic than any fairy prince. "I shall have him smiling within a week." Mina, watching the towers draw closer, thought only that she was glad no one would expect her to try. She was wrong, though she would not learn it for some days yet. The first evening at Ravenscliffe was a crush of silk and candlelight, of introductions and curtsies, of mothers positioning daughters like pieces on a chessboard. Mina found her usual place at the edge of things, near enough to be present, far enough to be forgotten. And it was from this vantage that she first saw him. He did not look the way she had expected. She had imagined some scowling, aged figure, but the Duke of Everleigh was young still, perhaps 30, tall and dark-haired, with a face that might have been called handsome if it were not so carefully guarded. He moved through his own ballroom like a man attending someone else's funeral. Polite. Correct. Entirely absent behind his own eyes. Every young lady who curtsied before him received the same courteous half-bow, the same brief, unreadable glance, and then he moved on, leaving each one flushed with hope that would, Mina suspected, come to nothing. She watched Rosalind curtsy to him with practiced grace, watched her mother's face bright with anticipation, and felt, unexpectedly, a small ache of pity for the girl she did not know. Whatever wound had made this man so guarded, it was not one that a pretty curtsy would heal. She did not expect him to look at her at all, and so she was startled, truly startled, when his gaze passed over the room and caught, for the briefest moment, on her own. It was nothing. A glance. Gone as quickly as it came. She told herself it meant nothing, that his eyes had simply swept the room as any host's must, and she returned her attention to the plate of food she had been given the task of arranging. For even at Ravenscliffe, Mina had found herself pressed into usefulness, helping the overwhelmed housekeeper manage the endless demands of 24 aristocratic guests. It was, she thought, at least honest work, unlike the elaborate performance of courtship happening around her. She did not know that the Duke of Everleigh had noticed something in that single glance that he had not noticed in any other woman in that glittering room, that she alone had not been watching him. Every other lady in that ballroom had contrived, in some fashion, to be seen by him. This one, plain in her grey gown, had been entirely occupied in arranging lilies, indifferent to his presence as though he were no more remarkable than the footman. Julian Thorne had spent 3 years being wanted for his title and his fortune. He had forgotten, until that moment, what it felt like to be beneath someone's notice, and he found, to his own surprise, that he wished to know why. He did not approach her that first night. He was not a man who did anything without deliberation, and 3 years of guarding himself against fortune hunters had taught him patience above all things. But he asked his aunt, the Dowager Duchess, in passing, who the quiet woman near the flowers might be. "That is Miss Wilhelmina Ashworth," the Duchess said, with the faint disapproval of a woman who kept careful accounts of every family's standing. "The elder Ashworth daughter. Plain girl. Quite unremarkable, though I hear she is clever with figures and manages her father's household accounts, since her mother has no head for it. The younger sister, Rosalind, is the beauty everyone speaks of." "I did not ask about the younger sister," Julian said, and something in his voice made his aunt look at him more closely than she had in a year. He watched Mina again that night, from across the room, and told no one that he did. 2 days passed before he devised his test. It was not born of cruelty, whatever he might later be accused of. It was born of scar tissue, of a wound that had never properly healed. Cordelia Vane had been beautiful and charming, and had spoken words of love so convincingly that Julian, then 26 and freshly made duke by his father's sudden death, had believed every one of them. She had worn his mother's sapphires to their betrothal ball. She had wept, or seemed to weep, when he spoke of his grief for his father. And then, 3 weeks before their wedding, she had disappeared in the night with every piece of Thorne jewellery she could carry, leaving behind only a note that spoke, without apology, of a wealthier prospect in the north. Since that night, Julian Thorne had trusted no declaration of affection that was not proven, and no character that had not been tested where it could not know it was being watched. It had become, in the years since, something between a habit and a private ritual, whenever a new lady entered his household under any pretense of courtship. He would leave some small, valuable object where it might easily be found and easily kept. A coin, once a bracelet, and this time a gold locket that had belonged to his late mother, small and finely wrought, its clasp shaped like a rose, containing a miniature portrait of his mother as a young woman. It was not a fortune, but to a family of straitened means it would be tempting enough, and its return or its disappearance would tell him more about a woman's character than 100 ballroom conversations ever could. He did not do this for Rosalind Ashworth, though she was, by every calculation his aunt made aloud, the likeliest candidate for his hand. He told himself, as he placed the locket carefully upon the stone bench in the walled garden, where he had observed Mina Ashworth walking alone each morning before the household woke, that he was testing the family as a whole, that any of the guests might find it, that it was simply chance which family's daughter walked that path each dawn. He was not being honest with himself, and some quiet part of him knew it even as he turned away. Mina found the locket the following morning, exactly as he had known she would. She had taken to walking in the walled garden before breakfast, when the great house was still hushed, and no one required anything of her, when she could be simply herself, rather than the useful shadow her family required. The garden was beautiful in the low autumn light, roses gone to hips, ivy climbing the old grey stone, and it was on the stone bench, beneath the ivy, that she saw the small gleam of gold. She lifted the locket carefully, turning it over in her gloved fingers. It was exquisitely made, far too fine to belong to any servant, its rose-shaped clasp catching the morning light. She opened it, and found within a miniature portrait of a lady with kind eyes and the same dark hair as the Duke, and she understood at once, with a small lurch of feeling, that this must be his mother, and that whoever had lost this locket had lost something precious indeed. She did not think, even for a moment, of what such a piece might fetch if sold. She thought only that someone, somewhere in this great house, must be searching for it in some private anguish, the way she herself had once searched for her own late grandmother's ring, lost for 3 days, and found again beneath a floorboard. And she remembered the particular grief of believing a piece of someone she loved had been lost to her forever. She closed the locket gently, tucked it into her reticule, and went directly to inquire who might have charge of lost articles in so grand a household. She did not know, as she walked toward the house, that she was being watched from an upper window, nor that the man watching her held his breath, without quite knowing why. The housekeeper, Mrs. Fenwick, was not able to say to whom the locket belonged, though she paled visibly at the sight of it, and said only that Mina had best take it directly to his Grace, for it looked very like a piece that had belonged to the late Duchess. Mina's stomach dropped at the thought of seeking a private audience with the Duke of Everleigh, a man whose reputation for coldness had followed him into every drawing-room in the county, but she told herself firmly that a lost treasure was no less lost for her own discomfort, and she asked to be shown to his study. She was left waiting in the corridor outside his door for what felt an eternity, clutching her reticule, rehearsing what she might say, when the door opened and she found herself, quite suddenly, looking up into the Duke's dark and unreadable eyes. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and there was something strange in his voice, something she could not name. "I understand you wish to see me. I did not wish to trouble your Grace," she said, and heard how foolish it sounded even as she said it. "Only I found something this morning, in the garden, and Mrs. Fenwick believed it ought to come to you directly." She held out the locket upon her open palm. For a long moment he did not move. He looked at the locket, and then at her, with an expression she could not read at all, something between disbelief and a kind of pain he was working very hard to conceal. "Where did you find this?" he asked, and his voice had gone quiet, almost rough. "Upon the stone bench, beneath the ivy, in the walled garden," she said. "I confess I opened it, hoping to learn to whom it belonged, and found a portrait within. I believe it may be your mother, your Grace. I am sorry if I have been forward in looking." "You were not forward," he said. "You were honest." And there was such weight in the word honest that she looked up at him in some confusion, not understanding why so simple a word should be spoken as though it were a rare and precious thing. He took the locket from her palm, his fingers brushing hers only briefly, and closed his hand around it as though it was something that might yet slip away. "Thank you, Miss Ashworth," he said. "You cannot know what this means to me." She curtsied, murmured something about being glad to have been of use, and left him standing in his study doorway, and she did not see the way he watched her go, nor the way his jaw tightened with something that was not quite triumph and not quite shame. He had tested her, and she had passed without knowing there had been a test at all, and Julian Thorne found himself unsettled by how deeply that simple fact had moved him. He told himself it proved nothing beyond her honesty in this one small matter. He told himself Cordelia, too, had seemed honest in small matters, before she was not honest in the large ones. But he found over the days that followed that he could not stop watching Wilhelmina Ashworth, could not stop noticing the small things about her that no one else at Ravenscliffe seemed to see at all. He noticed that she rose early and walked alone, not to be seen, but because she genuinely loved the quiet. He noticed that she spent an hour each afternoon helping his aunt's companion, an elderly woman named Miss Pruitt, whom most guests treated as furniture. With a piece of needlework the old woman's failing eyes could no longer manage alone. He noticed that when Rosalind Ashworth performed at the pianoforte to great applause, it was Mina who turned the pages, unthanked, unremarked, her own considerable skill at the instrument, which he glimpsed only once when she thought herself unobserved in the music room, kept carefully hidden so as not to outshine her sister. He began to seek reasons to be near her. He told himself each time that these were mere courtesies, the ordinary attentions a host owed his guests. He asked after her father's health, having learned that Mr. Ashworth suffered from a weak chest. He arranged, without appearing to arrange anything, that she should be seated near enough to him at dinner that conversation was possible. He found himself, on the fourth evening, walking the same garden path at the same early hour she walked it, and telling himself it was coincidence, though he had never once risen so early in his life before that week. "You are abroad early again, Your Grace," Mina said, when they met beneath the ivy, and there was no flirtation in her voice at all, only simple observation, which somehow pleased him more than any calculated charm could have done. "I find I sleep poorly of late," he said, which was true, though he did not say why. "I am sorry to hear it," she said, and seemed to mean it, and they walked together in a silence that was not uncomfortable, past the roses gone to hips, past the old sundial green with moss, and he found himself, for the first time in 3 years, speaking freely to a woman about something other than the weather or the season's gossip. "You do not ask me about the locket," he said finally, for it had been sitting between them, unspoken, since the day she returned it. "I did not think it my place," she said. "It seemed a private grief." "It was my mother's," he said. "She died when I was 22. My father followed a year later, and I inherited everything all at once, the title, the estate, the debts of grief no one warns you of. The locket was among the few things of hers I kept close. I do not know how it came to be lost in the garden." This was not entirely true, and he felt the small dishonesty of it settle uncomfortably in his chest. But he was not yet ready to tell her the whole truth, that he had placed it there himself, that he had been testing her as though she were a horse to be examined for soundness before purchase. He told himself he would explain it later, when he understood his own feelings better, when he was certain this was not simply another Cordelia in a plainer gown. But feelings, once begun, do not wait for convenient moments, and Julian Thorne found himself falling, slowly and against every guarded instinct he possessed, into something he had sworn 3 years ago never to feel again. Mina, for her part, told herself firmly that the Duke's attentions meant nothing beyond ordinary kindness. She had spent 24 years learning not to hope, and she was not about to abandon so hard-won a lesson for a handful of garden walks and dinner conversations. And yet she found herself, despite every resolution, watching for him at breakfast, listening for his voice in the corridor, feeling a small, unaccountable warmth whenever his dark eyes found hers across a crowded room. It could not last, of course, this quiet, unremarked happiness. Nothing so fragile ever did, not in a house full of ambitious mothers and calculating rivals, and it was Mina's own sister who first noticed what was happening, and did not like it at all. "You have been walking with the Duke," Rosalind said one afternoon, in the sharp, bright voice she used only when she was displeased, as the sisters dressed for the evening's entertainment. "Every morning this week. Mother has noticed. I have noticed. We happened to walk at the same hour," Mina said carefully, fastening her sister's necklace with practiced fingers. For even now the old habits of usefulness had not left her. "It is nothing, Rosalind. He has scarcely looked twice at me beyond ordinary courtesy. He looked at you tonight at dinner 3 times that I counted," Rosalind said, and there was something beneath her bright tone that was almost fear. The particular fear of a girl who had never once in her life had to compete for attention, and did not know how to bear the possibility of losing. "You must stop it, Mina. You know Mother has staked everything on my marrying him. Father's debts, the mortgage on the home farm, everything depends upon it. You cannot be so selfish as to risk that for the sake of a few garden walks that mean nothing to you." Mina felt the old familiar weight settle over her, the weight of being the daughter who was expected to want nothing, so that her sister might have everything. "I have done nothing to encourage him," she said quietly. "I promise you that. See that you continue not to," Rosalind said, and left the room in a swirl of blue silk, and Mina sat alone before the looking-glass for a long moment, studying her own plain, tired face, and telling herself that her sister was right to be afraid, that whatever small thing had begun to bloom between herself and the Duke of Everleigh could not possibly be permitted to grow, not when so much depended upon it dying quietly and quickly. She resolved, that night, to withdraw. She would walk no more in the garden at dawn. She would seat herself, at dinner, as far from him as courtesy allowed. She would make herself invisible again as she had always been, and let her sister have what her sister had been promised. It was a resolution that lasted exactly 2 days, for the world, as it so often does, had other plans. The trouble began with a whisper that travelled the length of the house party like fire through dry grass, that the Duke of Everleigh had been seen giving Miss Wilhelmina Ashworth a private tour of the portrait gallery, that he had lingered there above an hour. That laughter, actual laughter, rare and startling from so grave a man, had been heard through the closed door. It was true, though not in the way the gossips imagined. Julian had found her there by accident, studying a portrait of his grandfather with an expression of such genuine interest that he had been unable to resist joining her, and their conversation had wandered from family history to books to the small. Foolish things that make up real intimacy, and somewhere in that hour he had laughed, truly laughed, for what felt the first time in years, and Mina had laughed with him, and neither of them had noticed the door left ajar, nor the maid who passed and carried the tale below stairs within the hour. By the following morning the tale had grown teeth. It was said that Miss Ashworth had contrived the whole encounter, that she had lured the Duke away from more suitable company, that a woman who had returned a lost trinket with such theatrical honesty had done so only to secure his notice, that the entire episode of the locket had been staged from the start by a scheming elder sister, desperate to secure a match her plainness could never have won. Honestly, Mina heard the whispers at breakfast, saw the sidelong glances, felt the particular cruelty of a room full of people who had decided, collectively and without evidence, that her one moment of simple honesty had been calculation all along. She saw her mother's face, white with fury and fear, saw Rosalind's eyes bright with something that looked almost like satisfaction, and understood, with a sinking heart, that whatever had begun to grow between herself and the Duke was now in very great danger. The Dowager Duchess sent for her that same afternoon. Mina went to the small parlour with a composure she did not feel, and found the old woman seated very upright by the window, her expression unreadable, a cup of tea untouched before her. "Sit, Miss Ashworth," the Duchess said, and Mina sat. "I will speak plainly, for I have not the patience for anything else at my age. There is talk that you have set your cap most deliberately at my nephew, that the business of the locket was a piece of theatre, designed to win his notice and his sympathy both. I wish to hear from your own lips whether this is true." Mina felt her throat tighten, but she made herself meet the old woman's eyes. "It is not true, Your Grace. I found the locket exactly as I said I did, and returned it because it seemed to me the only honest thing to do with something that plainly belonged to someone else. I did not know it was His Grace's, not truly, until I stood before his study door. I have sought nothing from him beyond ordinary courtesy, and I would not know how to scheme for a man's affections if my life depended upon it. I have had very little practice at being noticed at all." There was something in the plain bitterness of that last sentence that seemed to catch the Duchess's attention, for her sharp eyes softened, just slightly. "You are the elder sister," the Duchess said, "the one who is not remarked upon." "I am, Your Grace." "And do you love him?" the Duchess asked, with the bluntness of the very old, who have long since stopped pretending that delicacy serves any purpose. Mina opened her mouth to deny it, and found, to her own horror, that she could not. "I do not know what I feel," she said instead, which was as close to the truth as she could bear to come. "I know only that I have not sought his attention, and that I would rather leave Ravenscliffe tomorrow than be thought a schemer." The Duchess studied her for a long moment, and then, unexpectedly, reached out and patted Mina's gloved hand. "That," she said, "is precisely what I needed to hear. You may go, Miss Ashworth, and hold your head up as you do. Gossip is the sport of the idle, and you have never in your life been idle." Mina left the parlour with tears she refused to shed burning behind her eyes, and it was in the corridor beyond that she encountered Julian, who had clearly been waiting, and whose face, when he saw her distress, darkened with an anger she had never seen in him before. "Someone has upset you," he said, and it was not a question. "It is nothing, Your Grace," she said, though her voice betrayed her. "It is not nothing," he said. "I have heard the whispers, Miss Ashworth. I know what is being said of you, and I will not have it. Not in my own house." "Perhaps," Mina said with more bitterness than she intended, "it would be simplest if I were not in your house at all. My presence seems to have caused a great deal of trouble for a great many people, and I begin to think my sister and mother were right to fear it." "Do not speak so," Julian said, and there was such raw feeling in his voice that she looked up at him in surprise. "I will not pretend I do not know how this began, Miss Ashworth. I owe you the truth, and I have delayed too long in giving it. The locket was not lost. I placed it in the garden myself, knowing you walked there each morning, because I wished to know what manner of woman you were when you believed no one was watching. It was cruel of me, perhaps, and I did it because I have been deceived before, badly, by a woman who wore honesty as a costume, and I no longer trust my own judgment of character without some proof beyond words. You passed a test you did not know you were taking, Miss Ashworth, and I have spent every day since falling further into feelings I swore I would never permit myself again. The talk below stairs is cruel and it is wrong, but the truth beneath it, that I have sought you out, that I have wished for your company above any other in this house, that much, I confess, is entirely true." Mina stood very still, absorbing this, feeling a dozen emotions crowd against one another. Astonishment, a flicker of anger at having been tested without her knowledge, and beneath it all, unmistakably, a warmth she could not suppress no matter how she tried. "You tested me," she said slowly, "as though I were a horse at auction." "I did," he said, with no attempt to soften it, "and I am ashamed of the manner of it, even as I am grateful for what it showed me. I do not ask you to forgive the method. I ask only that you believe what has grown from it is real." "How can I know that?" Mina asked, "when everything between us began with a deception? How am I to trust that what you feel is not simply relief at finding a woman who did not steal from you, mistaken for something deeper?" It was a fair question, and she saw it strike him, saw him search for an answer, and find none that satisfied even himself. "I do not know how to prove it to you," he admitted, "except by time, and by every day that follows, in which I hope to show you that what I feel has grown well beyond the locket and its answer." "That is not enough," Mina said, though it cost her a great deal to say it, for some foolish part of her wished only to believe him. "Not while my family's future hangs on my sister's chances with you, not while the whole house believes me a schemer, not while I do not know my own heart clearly enough to risk it. I think, Your Grace, that I must go home." She left him standing in the corridor and did not look back, though it took every ounce of composure she possessed not to. She told her mother that evening that she wished to return home, citing a headache, citing homesickness, citing anything but the truth, and her mother, delighted to have the rival for her favorite daughter's prospects removed, agreed with unseemly haste that the carriage should be readied for the following morning. Rosalind, strangely, said nothing at all, though Mina caught her watching with an expression that was not quite triumph and not quite guilt. It was Rosalind who came to Mina's room that night, long after the house had gone quiet, and sat upon the edge of the bed with an unfamiliar seriousness in her young face. "I have done something terrible," Rosalind said, without preamble, "and I cannot let you leave tomorrow believing it was only gossip that drove you away." Mina sat up slowly. "What do you mean?" "The maid who spread the tale of the portrait gallery," Rosalind said, twisting her hands together. "I paid her to embellish it. I did not invent the encounter, that much was true, but I paid her to say you had contrived it, that the locket was your own scheme from the beginning. I was frightened, Mina. Mother has told me every day since we were children that everything depends upon my marrying well, that father's debts will ruin us all if I do not, and when I saw how he looked at you, I panicked, and I did something cruel, and I am more ashamed of it than I have ever been of anything in my life." Mina felt something cold settle in her chest, followed swiftly by something that was almost relief. The relief of finally understanding the shape of the thing that had hurt her. "Why tell me now?" she asked quietly. "Because you are leaving tomorrow believing yourself unwanted and unworthy of trust, when the truth is that you are the only person in that entire house who did not want anything from him at all," Rosalind said, and her voice broke. "I have watched you my whole life put yourself last, so that I might come first, and I let you do it, and I told myself it was simply how things were meant to be. Because you never once complained. But you deserve better than what I did to you this week, Mina. You deserve to know that whatever he feels for you, it was never a lie you told to win it." Mina reached out, despite everything, and took her sister's hand. "You must tell him the truth," she said, "not for my sake alone, but for your own. You cannot build a life, Rosalind, on a foundation of other people's unhappiness. I forgive you, but you must undo what you have done." Rosalind wept and promised she would, and left Mina alone with her thoughts long into the night, and Mina lay awake, turning over everything that had happened, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that beneath the hurt and the confusion, what she felt most clearly was hope, fragile, unfamiliar, and entirely unwelcome, in a heart that had spent 24 years protecting itself from exactly this feeling. She did not leave the following morning after all. Rosalind, true to her word, went at first light to the Dowager Duchess and confessed everything. The maid, the embellished gossip, her own fear and jealousy, and asked that the truth be made known before Mina's carriage departed. The Duchess, who had already half suspected some such scheme, summoned the maid, confirmed the confession, and by mid-morning the truth had travelled through Ravenscliffe with the same speed the lie had, though this time it carried Mina's name cleared rather than sullied. Julian came to find her in the walled garden, where she stood once more beneath the ivy, the same spot where this entire strange, painful, wondrous week had begun. "I have heard everything," he said. "Your sister came to me herself, before she went to my aunt, and told me what she had done, and what you said to her in return. I do not think I have ever heard of a kindness so undeserved as the one you showed her." "She is my sister," Mina said simply, "and she was frightened, as I have been frightened my whole life, of not being enough to matter. I understand that fear better than most." "You will always matter," Julian said, and crossed the distance between them, and there was nothing guarded in his face now. Nothing tested or measured, only a plainness of feeling that matched her own. "I told you I could not prove what I felt except by time, and I stand by that. But I would like the chance to spend that time proving it, if you will permit me. Not because you passed some test with a locket, Miss Ashworth, but because in every hour since, you have shown me 100 small honesties I did not test for, and did not expect. Your kindness to Miss Pruitt, your patience with your sister, your composure under gossip that would have broken a lesser spirit. I did not fall in love with the woman who returned a locket. I fell in love with the woman who has done 100 quiet, unremarked, unrewarded kindnesses that no one but I seem to have noticed at all." Mina felt the tears she had refused to shed the day before finally rise, unstoppable now. "I have spent my whole life being the daughter no one looked at twice," she said. "I do not know how to be looked at the way you look at me. I do not know how to trust that it will not simply vanish, the way every good thing in my life seems to." "Then let me teach you," Julian said, and took her hand, ungloved this time, his fingers warm against her own. "Slowly, if that is what you need. I am not a patient man by nature, Miss Ashworth, but I find I have discovered a great deal of patience where you are concerned." She laughed, unexpectedly, through her tears. The same laughter he had drawn from her in the portrait gallery, and it seemed to settle something in him. Some tension he had carried since Cordelia's betrayal 3 years past, easing at last. "I should like that," she said. "I should like that very much." Their quiet happiness, however, was not permitted to grow entirely unchallenged, for the world beyond the walled garden had its own claims upon Wilhelmina Ashworth, and those claims arrived, as such things so often do, in the form of a letter. It came for her father 3 days after the truth of Rosalind's scheme had been laid bare, while Mina and Julian were still feeling their way, carefully and joyfully, into the first unguarded days of an understanding neither of them had yet named aloud. Mr. Ashworth read the letter at breakfast, and Mina watched the colour drain slowly from his face, watched his hand tremble upon the paper, and knew before he spoke a word that whatever news it carried was grave. "It is from Pembroke," her father said at last, folding the letter with hands that would not quite be still. "He has called in the debt, all of it, and at once. £3,000, Mina, which I have not the means to pay within the year, let alone within the month he demands." Mina knew the name Pembroke well enough, and liked it little. "Mister, Edmund Pembroke was a wealthy widower of some 40 years, a man who had made his fortune in trade and spent the better part of a decade attempting to purchase, through careful loans and calculated kindnesses, a place in society that his manners had never quite earned him. He had lent her father a considerable sum 3 winters past, when a failed harvest had threatened to ruin them entirely, and Mina had always suspected, with a cold unease she had never spoken aloud, that the loan had been made with some future purpose in mind beyond simple friendship. She learned the shape of that purpose within the hour, when Mr. Pembroke himself arrived at Ravenscliffe, uninvited but not, given the size of his purse, easily turned away, and asked to speak with her privately in the small morning room. "I have called in the debt," he said, without much preamble, for he was not a man given to delicacy, "because I find myself, at my age, in want of a wife, and I have long admired your sense and your steadiness, Miss Ashworth, qualities I confess I value rather more than the fashionable accomplishments your sister possesses in such abundance. Marry me, and the debt is forgiven entirely. Your father need never think of it again. Your family's home is secured. Refuse, and I fear I shall have no choice but to press for repayment in full, which I understand would mean the loss of the home farm, and very likely worse besides." Mina sat very still, feeling the walls of the pleasant morning room close in around her as surely as any prison. "You would ruin my family," she said slowly, "if I do not marry you." "I would prefer not to think of it as ruin," Mr. Pembroke said, with the bland, untroubled certainty of a man who had never once had to fear ruin himself. "I would prefer to think of it as a sensible arrangement, of the kind made every day among families of good sense. You are not a girl for romantic fancies, Miss Ashworth. I had thought you, of all people, would understand the practical necessity of it." She did understand it, that was the bitterest part. She understood it exactly, understood the particular arithmetic of duty and sacrifice that had governed her whole life, the arithmetic that had always required her to want less, so that others might have more. She thought of her father's weak chest, of the home farm that had been in her family for 4 generations, of her mother's genuine terror at the thought of ruin, and she thought too, with an ache that nearly stole her breath entirely, of Julian, of the locket resting warm against memory, of a happiness she had only just begun to permit herself to believe in. She asked for a fortnight to consider his offer, and Mr. Pembroke, satisfied that the matter was as good as settled, granted it with the easy grace of a man who had never once been refused anything he had set his mind to acquire. She did not tell Julian. That was perhaps her first true mistake in the whole of this delicate unfolding love. Not the silence itself, but the reasoning behind it. The old, deep-rooted belief that her own happiness must always be weighed last against the needs of everyone around her, that to burden him with her family's ruin would be to ask too much of a man who had only just begun, so tentatively, to trust again. She grew quiet in the days that followed, quiet in a way Julian noticed at once, for he had learned already to read the small shifts in her face the way other men read a ledger, and he came to her in the library on the 4th evening, where she sat with a book open before her that she had not turned a single page of in an hour. "You are troubled," he said, taking the seat beside her, "and you have been troubled since Pembroke's carriage left the drive. I do not ask idly, Wilhelmina. I ask because I find I cannot bear to watch you carry some grief alone that I might help you carry instead." She resisted at first, from long habit, but his patience was gentler than anything she had ever been offered, and it undid her at last, and she told him everything. The debt, the fortnight's grace, the arithmetic of ruin that had governed every choice her family had ever made, and her own fear that to refuse Pembroke was to choose her own happiness over her father's health and her family's home. She had expected anger, perhaps, or the wounded withdrawal of a man who felt himself deceived by her silence. She had not expected the particular stillness that came over Julian's face instead. the stillness of a man arriving at a decision he had perhaps already, in some quiet corner of his heart, been circling for days. "You will not marry Pembroke," he said, "though I understand entirely why you considered it, and I do not think less of you for the considering. I only wish you had trusted me sooner with the weight of it." "I did not wish to make my family's troubles your burden," she said. "You have already given me more than I ever expected to have." "Then let me give you this as well," Julian said, "for it is no burden at all, but a joy, to be permitted to protect what I love. I shall settle your father's debt myself, tonight, by messenger, and Pembroke may take his £3,000 and his conditions and trouble your family no further. And then, Wilhelmina, when the debt no longer stands between us at all, I intend to ask you a question I have been building toward since the morning you handed me back my mother's locket, without a single thought of what it might have bought you instead." She wept then, though they were not unhappy tears, and he held her hand across the small distance between their chairs, and did not let go for a long while. The debt was settled within the week, the messenger returning with Pembroke's grudging acknowledgment that the sum had been received in full, and his claims upon the Ashworth family thereby extinguished. Mr. Pembroke did not trouble them again, though it was said afterward, with some satisfaction among the servants who had never liked his manner, that he departed the county entirely within the month, his pride considerably more wounded than his purse. It was not, however, quite so simple a resolution as it seemed, for word of the Duke's intervention travelled, as all things at Ravenscliffe seemed to, and reached the ears of the very people least inclined to view it kindly. There were those among the assembled guests, a Lady Ferris chief among them, whose own daughter had spent the fortnight in fruitless pursuit of the Duke's attention, who declared it scandalous that a Duke should settle the debts of a family so plainly beneath his own consequence. And scandal, once spoken aloud in a house full of idle guests, has a way of gathering weight it does not deserve. "They will say you bought her," Julian's aunt warned him plainly, over tea the following afternoon, though there was less disapproval in her voice than concern. "That you have purchased a bride the way another man might purchase a hunter, and that Miss Ashworth allowed her family's ruin to be engineered for precisely this purpose. You must consider carefully, Julian, before you make your intentions known publicly, for whatever you decide, the whole county will have an opinion upon it, and Miss Ashworth will bear the greater share of their unkindness." It was a fair warning, and Julian carried it with him through a long, restless night, weighing his own certainty against the very real cost his choice might exact upon the woman he loved. He had learned, 3 years past, what it was to have his trust exploited by gossip and appearance rather than truth. He would not, he decided at last, permit the same cruelty to be visited upon Mina by his own hesitation. He went to her the following morning in the walled garden, where the last of the autumn roses had finally given way to bare, thorny stems, and found her sitting quietly upon the very bench where the locket had first been placed, and he understood, looking at her there, that whatever the county chose to whisper, he had never in his life been more certain of anything than he was of her. "I have been warned," he said, sitting beside her, "that settling your father's debt will be spoken of unkindly, that some will say I purchased you, and that you will bear the worst of that unkindness for a choice that was entirely my own to make." "I had already guessed as much," Mina said, with the quiet steadiness that had first drawn his notice across a crowded ballroom. "I have spent my whole life bearing the unkindness of rooms that did not think me worth their consideration. I find I am rather well practiced at it, and I do not think I shall break beneath a little more." "You should not have to be practiced at it at all," Julian said, "and I mean to see that you never need be again, which is why I do not intend merely to settle a debt and let the matter rest there, leaving room for every idle tongue in the county to make of it what they will. I intend to answer it plainly, before the whole of Ravenscliffe, in a manner no one could mistake for anything but the truth." She looked at him, uncertain what he meant, and he took her hand, there upon the cold stone bench. beneath the bare branches of the ivy that had first sheltered a small gold locket, and unknowingly the whole of his heart besides. "I do not intend to hide what I feel for you a moment longer, Wilhelmina Ashworth," he said. "Not behind careful courtesies, not behind garden walks no one is meant to notice. I mean to claim you before every guest in this house, so plainly and so publicly that no one, not Lady Ferris, not Pembroke, not the whole of the gossiping county, shall ever again mistake the truth of it for scandal." The house party at Ravenscliffe concluded, as such gatherings always did, with a grand ball, and it was there, before the assembled guests who had whispered and gossiped and speculated all week, that the Duke of Everleigh did something no one had expected, and everyone would speak of for seasons afterward. He did not dance first with the acknowledged beauty of the season, though Rosalind, restored now to Mina's good graces and genuinely glad of it, stood ready and smiling nearby. He crossed the floor directly to Wilhelmina Ashworth, plain in her grey gown among the silks and jewels, and bowed before her with the same formal courtesy he had shown every lady that week, and then spoiled the formality entirely by smiling, openly, unmistakably, in a way the whole room could see. "Miss Ashworth," he said, loudly enough to be heard by every straining ear in the ballroom, "will you do me the honor of the first dance?" A murmur ran through the assembled guests, sharp with astonishment, for the Duke of Everleigh had danced with no one first in 3 long years, had been thought incapable of it, and here he stood, asking the plainest, quietest, most overlooked woman in the room, and asking as though there could be no other answer in the world. Mina, feeling every eye upon her for the first time in her life, and finding, to her own surprise, that she did not mind it at all, placed her hand in his. "I will, Your Grace," she said, and the room broke into astonished whispers as they took the floor, and Mina Ashworth, who had spent 24 years believing herself destined for the shadows, danced beneath the great chandeliers of Ravenscliffe, with a warmth in her chest she had never once dared to hope for. Her mother watched with an expression caught somewhere between shock and calculation. Already, Mina suspected, revising her opinion of her elder daughter's prospects. Rosalind watched with unmistakable relief and genuine happiness, applauding when the dance concluded with more enthusiasm than anyone else in the room. And the Dowager Duchess, observing from her seat near the fire, permitted herself the smallest and most satisfied of smiles, for she had lost a wager with no one and gained, she suspected, a niece far better suited to her nephew's healing than any beauty the season had produced. Lady Ferris, it must be admitted, did not receive the sight with any such grace. She was heard to remark, rather too loudly for discretion, that the whole affair smacked of a duke grown soft in his judgment, that a plain girl with no fortune and a family scarcely out of debt was no fit match for a peer of the realm, however cleverly she had contrived to seem otherwise. But her complaint found little audience that night, for the room, having witnessed the Duke's open and unguarded delight, had already begun to reconsider everything it had thought it understood about Miss Ashworth, and gossip, which had turned so quickly against her a week before, turned now, just as quickly in her favor, for society loves nothing so much as a story it may claim, after the fact, to have seen coming all along. Julian did not dance with anyone else that evening, a fact remarked upon by every mother in the room with a daughter still unmarried, and when the musicians at last struck up a slower air near midnight, he drew Mina away from the crowded floor, out through the tall glass doors and onto the terrace, where the autumn air was cold and clean, and the stars hung bright and close above the darkened gardens below. "I have a question I have been meaning to ask you," he said, and there was a nervousness in his voice she had never heard there before, a nervousness that seemed almost incongruous in so composed and guarded a man, and it pleased her more than she could say to see him made, however briefly, as unsteady by love as she herself had been made these past weeks. "I had thought to ask it with more ceremony. A ring prepared, my aunt's blessing formally sought, some grand declaration befitting a duke. But I find, standing here with you, that I have never once cared for ceremony where you are concerned, only for truth. And the truth is that I love you, Wilhelmina Ashworth, more completely than I believed myself capable of loving anyone again. And I do not wish to spend one more day without the right to say so before the whole of the world. Then say so, Mina whispered, her heart so full she could scarcely trust her own voice. Will you marry me? He asked. And there upon the moonlit terrace, with the music drifting faintly through the glass doors behind them, and the whole glittering ballroom forgotten entirely, Wilhelmina Ashworth, who had spent 24 years believing herself destined to stand always at the edge of other people's happiness, said yes, and felt, for the first time in her life, entirely and unmistakably seen. It was some months later, in the small chapel at Ravenscliffe, warmed by winter sunlight through old stained glass, that Wilhelmina Ashworth became Duchess of Everleigh, in a ceremony far smaller and far quieter than the grand society wedding her mother had once dreamed of for Rosalind, and far happier, Mina thought, than any grand affair could have been. Julian gave her, on their wedding morning, a small velvet box, and within it lay the gold locket, its rose-shaped clasp gleaming, though when she opened it now, she found within not only the miniature of his late mother, but a second, smaller portrait, newly painted, of herself. I did not think, when I placed it in that garden, that I was placing my whole heart there instead, he said, as he fastened it around her neck with careful hands. I thought I was testing your loyalty. I did not understand, until it was far too late to protect myself from it, that I was testing my own capacity to trust again, and that you would be the one to teach me I still had it in me. You never needed to test me, Mina said softly, her fingers resting over the locket, over the two hearts she now carried so close to her own, for I had nothing to gain by deceiving you, and everything, as it turned out, to gain by simply being myself. That, Julian said, drawing her close, is precisely why I love you, and precisely why I always will, not for the honesty of one single morning in a garden, but for every honest hour that has followed it since, and every one I intend to spend earning, for the rest of my life, the trust you gave me so freely before I ever deserved it. Outside the chapel, the bells of Ravenscliffe rang out over the frosted fields, and within, the woman who had spent her whole life believing herself unremarkable stood at last exactly where she belonged, not in her sister's shadow, not in anyone's shadow at all, but at the center of a love that had begun with a small gold locket, and grown, slowly and honestly, into something that no test, and no doubt, could ever again unmake. And in the years that followed, when their own children asked how their parents had fallen in love, Julian would tell them, with a smile Mina had taught him to wear so easily, that it had begun the morning their mother found a locket in a garden, and did not think, even for a moment, of keeping what was not hers, and that in returning it, she had unknowingly given him back something he had thought lost forever. The simple, unguarded belief that goodness, real and unperformed, still existed in the world, and had been waiting for him all along in the last place he had thought to look. Mina herself told the story differently, though no less fondly. She would tell her children that she had never set out to win a duke's heart, had never once schemed or calculated or hoped for anything beyond the small, quiet dignity of doing right by a stranger's lost treasure, and that this, in the end, had been the whole of it. That love, when it was real, did not need to be pursued or performed, only lived honestly, day after ordinary day, until someone finally troubled themselves to look closely enough to see it. She kept the locket always, wearing it beneath her gown on the anniversary of that first garden morning, a small weight of gold resting near her heart, a reminder of the moment her whole life had quietly, irrevocably changed. not because she had been chosen for her beauty or her fortune or her cleverness, but because, when no one was watching at all, she had simply chosen to be good. Rosalind married 2 years later, a kind and steady gentleman of modest fortune, whom she had met, fittingly enough, while visiting her sister at Ravenscliffe, and the two sisters remained close all their lives, the old rivalry long since dissolved into something gentler and truer, forged in the fire of a mistake, honestly confessed and generously forgiven. Mrs. Ashworth, for her part, never quite stopped reminding her acquaintances that she had always known her elder daughter would make a fine match, a claim that fooled no one who had witnessed the events of that autumn house party, but which everyone, out of affection for her happiness, was content to let stand unchallenged. As for the Duke and Duchess of Everleigh, they were spoken of in the years that followed, not for scandal or gossip, but for a devotion so evident and so unshaken that it became, in its own quiet way, the very story every ambitious mother in the county hoped for her own daughter, proof that the truest test of love was never grandeur, nor beauty, nor fortune, but the simple, steady honesty of a heart that gave freely, expecting nothing, and was at last seen and cherished exactly as it was.